The Pacific Ocean became a graveyard for the most powerful warships ever constructed, and the story of how that happened reveals one of warfare's most dramatic reversals. When you examine what transpired during those brutal years of combat, you discover something almost incomprehensible at first glance. The mightiest vessels ever to slice through ocean waters, floating cities of steel carrying enough firepower to level coastal towns, met their end at the hands of aircraft so small and fragile that a single machine gun burst could tear them apart. This wasn't supposed to be possible according to every naval theory that existed at the time. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested decades and unimaginable resources into creating what they believed would be the ultimate naval striking force. These weren't just ships in the conventional sense. They were monuments to industrial capability, floating demonstrations of national power, and instruments designed for one specific purpose: crushing the American Pacific Fleet in a climactic confrontation that would decide control of half the world's largest ocean. Every rivet, every plate of armor, every massive gun barrel represented a philosophy of warfare that stretched back centuries to the age of sail, when great ships stood toe-to-toe and pounded each other until one or the other surrendered or sank. Consider what went into constructing these leviathans. The Yamato-class battleships represented the pinnacle of this thinking. Her construction consumed resources equivalent to building several hundred fighter aircraft. The armor belt protecting her vitals measured 16 inches of hardened steel in places, thick enough that you could park a small car inside the thickness of that protective barrier. The main battery consisted of 9 guns, each 18.1 inches in diameter, capable of hurling shells that weighed more than an automobile over distances approaching 25 miles. When these guns fired in full broadsides, the concussion could kill unprotected personnel standing on the deck, and the blast effect could be felt for miles across open water. The crews manning these giants numbered in the thousands. Over 2,500 men served aboard Yamato alone, a population larger than many Japanese villages. These sailors worked in conditions that ranged from cramped machinery spaces where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees to exposed gun positions where they faced whatever the enemy could throw at them. They maintained endless systems, from the massive reduction gears that translated turbine rotation into propeller thrust, to the complex fire control computers that calculated firing solutions, to the electrical generators that powered everything from lighting to ammunition hoists. Japanese naval doctrine centered on what they called the decisive battle concept. This wasn't some vague strategic preference. It represented their entire approach to naval warfare, refined through decades of study and wargaming. The idea was straightforward in theory, though incredibly complex in execution. The combined fleet would maneuver to bring the American Pacific Fleet to battle under conditions favorable to Japan. When contact was made, battleships would form the main line, their massive guns would engage at maximum range, and superior Japanese marksmanship combined with superior ship design would systematically destroy American capital ships until the enemy fleet was annihilated. With the American fleet eliminated, Japan would have free rein across the Pacific, able to consolidate conquered territories and force negotiations from a position of overwhelming strength. This doctrine had historical precedent. The Battle of Tsushima in 1905 had validated these concepts when Admiral Togo's battleships destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in a crushing victory that shocked the world. Japan had studied that battle endlessly, analyzing every decision, every maneuver, every tactical choice. The decisive battle remained the holy grail of Japanese naval strategy, and battleships were the instruments that would achieve it. Everything else in the fleet existed to support these giants or to bring about the conditions necessary for them to engage. But something fundamental had changed in the decades between Tsushima and the Pacific War, something that Japanese naval planners either didn't fully grasp or chose to downplay. Warfare had acquired a third dimension. Ships no longer fought only against other ships on a two-dimensional plane of ocean surface. Now threats could come from above and below, from aircraft and submarines that operated in realms battleships couldn't effectively defend against or respond to. The very characteristics that made battleships powerful in surface combat became fatal vulnerabilities when facing aerial attack. Think about the limitations inherent in battleship design. These vessels were optimized for a specific kind of combat. Their armor concentrated on protecting against shells fired in relatively flat trajectories. The belt armor stood thickest along the waterline, where enemy shells would strike after crossing miles of ocean. Deck armor existed but was necessarily thinner because adding protection above meant adding weight high in the ship, which affected stability. The massive gun turrets could traverse and elevate to engage targets on the horizon, but they couldn't elevate high enough or traverse fast enough to track aircraft. The fire control systems that allowed these ships to compute firing solutions against distant surface targets were useless against fast-moving aerial targets approaching from variable angles and altitudes. Speed represented another critical limitation. Battleships could make 30 knots on a good day with calm seas and clean hulls. That sounds fast until you realize that even the lumbering torpedo planes that hunted them could fly at twice that speed or more. A battleship needed miles of ocean to complete a turn. An aircraft could reverse direction in seconds. The tactical mobility advantage lay entirely with the aircraft. A battleship captain facing an air attack had almost no options. He could increase speed, but he was already at maximum or close to it. He could maneuver, but his turning radius measured in thousands of yards. He could fire his anti-aircraft guns, but early war systems were woefully inadequate. Mostly, he could hope the combat air patrol intercepted attackers before they reached bombing or torpedo release points, and he could pray that any weapons released would miss. Now contrast that with what American naval aviation brought to the fight. The Douglas TBD Devastator that saw service in the war's early years was obsolete by any reasonable standard even when hostilities began. It was slow, with a maximum speed around 200 miles per hour. It was vulnerable, lacking armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. It carried a crew of 3 men crammed into an open or partially enclosed cockpit. The torpedo it carried, the Mark 13, was notoriously unreliable in early war versions, often running too deep, failing to explode, or simply running in circles. And yet this inadequate, obsolescent aircraft carried the means to cripple or kill the most powerful warships afloat. The weapon itself seems almost absurd when you consider the size disparity. A Mark 13 torpedo measured about 13 feet long and 22 inches in diameter. It weighed roughly 2,000 pounds, of which 500 pounds consisted of explosive material. Compare that to a battleship displacing 70,000 tons. The torpedo was a tiny fraction of the ship's mass, a needle against an elephant, but that needle was specifically designed to exploit the elephant's vulnerability. Unlike shells that had to penetrate armor, torpedoes exploded underwater against the ship's hull below the armor belt. The explosion created a bubble of gas that pushed outward with tremendous force, then collapsed inward, creating a vacuum effect. This hammer blow could rupture hull plates, tear open seams, and flood compartments that were never designed to contain the ocean. The damage model was different too. A shell hit, even from a large caliber gun, created localized damage. It might penetrate a turret, explode in a magazine, start fires, or kill crew members. But damage was generally confined to the area of impact and immediate surroundings. A torpedo hit was more insidious. Water flooding into breached compartments had to go somewhere. It flowed through passageways, down ladders, through cable runs and ventilation ducts. Damage control teams could shore up damaged areas and activate pumps, but pumps had limited capacity. If flooding exceeded pumping capability, the ship began to list as water accumulated on one side. That list made damage control harder because hatches no longer hung properly, pumps lost suction, and crew members struggled to move through passageways tilted at severe angles. Multiple torpedo hits created catastrophic conditions. Each new breach added more flooding. The list increased, stability decreased. Eventually, the ship reached a point where recovery became impossible. Pumps couldn't keep up. Flooding spread to machinery spaces, killing power. Without power, pumps stopped working entirely. The list became so severe that the ship could no longer fight effectively. Guns couldn't train properly. Fire control systems failed. Communications broke down. At some point, the captain faced a terrible decision: order abandon ship while men could still escape, or stay aboard hoping to save the vessel until it was too late to save the crew. The Battle of Midway, in early June 1942, demonstrated these dynamics with terrible clarity. Japan sent its most powerful striking force toward that small atoll. 4 fleet carriers escorted by battleships and cruisers, supported by submarines and land-based aircraft. The plan called for the carriers to neutralize Midway's defenses, after which invasion forces would seize the atoll. The Americans, they calculated, would have to respond, bringing their depleted carrier force within range where Japanese battleships and aircraft could destroy it. The decisive battle would finally occur, and American naval power in the Pacific would cease to exist. What happened instead became one of history's most studied naval battles. American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese communications enough to understand that something big was planned against Midway. The Pacific Fleet, though badly outnumbered in every category of warship, prepared an ambush. 3 American carriers positioned themselves northeast of Midway, waiting for the Japanese force to approach. When contact was made, both sides launched strikes. The American torpedo plane attacks that followed were slaughter. The Devastators from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 approached first, flying low and slow toward the Japanese carriers. Japanese fighters, the famous Zeros, dove on them like hawks on pigeons. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening ships filled the sky with tracers and exploding shells. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Of 15 aircraft that began the attack run, all 15 were destroyed. 14 crew members died. 1 man survived, floating in the ocean for hours before rescue. Torpedo 8 achieved nothing in conventional terms. Not one torpedo hit, not one Japanese ship was damaged. But their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown that followed them in, accomplished something crucial. The Japanese carriers had been preparing to launch their own strike against the American carriers. Aircraft sat on deck fueled and armed, ready for launch. But torpedo plane attacks forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, spoiling any chance of launching. The carriers twisted and turned, maintaining maximum speed, while fighters remained at low altitude dealing with torpedo threats. That's when American dive bombers arrived. While Japanese attention focused downward on torpedo planes skimming the wave tops, the dive bombers approached from high altitude, undetected and unopposed. They rolled into their attacks and released bombs that plunged down onto carrier flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. The results were catastrophic. 3 Japanese carriers took bomb hits within minutes. Fires spread instantly among aviation gasoline and munitions. Damage control teams fought heroically but couldn't contain the conflagrations. By evening, 3 carriers had sunk or been scuttled. A 4th was located and destroyed the following day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of experienced aircrew. American losses, though significant, were far lighter. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted, and it would never shift back. The battleships accompanying the Japanese carrier force barely participated. They were too far from the action when the carriers were hit. By the time they could close to gun range, darkness had fallen and American forces had withdrawn. The mighty guns that were supposed to decide the battle never fired at an enemy ship. Those battleships represented enormous investment in resources and manpower, but they contributed nothing to the battle's outcome. Air power had rendered them largely irrelevant. Pearl Harbor had already demonstrated what aircraft could do to battleships. That December morning saw Japanese carrier aircraft achieve near-perfect surprise against the American Pacific Fleet at anchor. Torpedo planes carrying specially modified weapons skimmed across the harbor, released their torpedoes at point-blank range, and devastated Battleship Row. Arizona took a torpedo hit that likely detonated a magazine, destroying the ship and killing over 1,100 men. Oklahoma suffered multiple torpedo hits that caused catastrophic flooding. The ship rolled completely over, trapping hundreds of men inside. West Virginia, California, and Nevada all took multiple torpedo hits that left them sunk or heavily damaged. The lesson was clear to anyone willing to see it. Battleships, for all their power and majesty, were hideously vulnerable to air attack. They couldn't dodge. They couldn't fight back effectively. Their armor, designed to stop shells, did nothing against torpedoes that exploded underwater. A weapon system that cost a fraction of what the battleship cost could send that battleship to the bottom. Yet Japan continued building and deploying battleships even as the war turned against them. The Yamato and her sister Musashi represented the ultimate expression of battleship design. No larger battleships were ever built or ever could be built given the constraints of dry docks and canals. These ships displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded. They stretched over 800 feet in length and measured over 120 feet wide. The propulsion system generated 150,000 horsepower, enough to push the ship to 27 knots despite its enormous mass. The armor scheme included that 16-inch belt, turret faces over 2 feet thick, and deck armor designed to resist plunging fire from the largest guns then known. The main battery of 9 18-inch guns could hurl shells weighing 3,000 pounds each. These shells could penetrate any armor then existing at ranges exceeding 20 miles. In theory, Yamato could stand off beyond the range of any American battleship and methodically destroy it with impunity. The fire control system used analog computers and optical rangefinders to calculate trajectories accounting for range, target speed and direction, wind, air temperature, and the rotation of the Earth itself. Japanese naval engineers had achieved near perfection in battleship design by standards that were already obsolete. Musashi, Yamato's sister, saw more action earlier in the war. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, she formed part of the Japanese surface force attempting to engage American carriers. American submarines detected the force and fired torpedoes. Musashi maneuvered to avoid most of them, but her presence in the battle area accomplished nothing as American carrier aircraft decimated Japanese naval aviation before surface forces could make contact. The following October brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history measured by numbers of ships and tonnage engaged. Japan committed virtually every operational warship remaining to them in a desperate attempt to destroy American amphibious forces landing on Leyte. The complex plan involved multiple task forces approaching from different directions to divide American attention and overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers and confusion. Musashi formed part of the center force approaching through the Sibuyan Sea. American submarines detected this force early and sent contact reports. American carrier aircraft from multiple task groups converged on the center force beginning mid-morning. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the day. Musashi became the primary target because intelligence indicated she was the most powerful ship present. The attacks continued for hours. Fighter cover proved inadequate. Anti-aircraft fire, though heavy, failed to stop determined attackers. Musashi absorbed punishment that would have sunk any other ship in the world. Bomb hits smashed through deck armor, starting fires and destroying gun positions. Torpedo hits ripped open the hull, flooding compartments and creating an increasing list. Damage control crews worked magnificently, shoring up bulkheads and managing flooding, but the hits kept coming. By late afternoon, Musashi had taken 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits. The list exceeded 20 degrees. Forward compartments were completely flooded. The ship could barely maintain steerage. Speed had dropped to barely 10 knots. The captain ordered abandon ship around evening. Men climbed down ropes and jumped into the sea as the ship's list increased. Musashi capsized and sank shortly after, taking over 1,000 men down with her. The most advanced battleship in the Japanese fleet had been overwhelmed by aircraft, exactly as Pearl Harbor had demonstrated was possible 3 years earlier. The lessons had been written in blood and steel, but Japan had no choice but to continue fighting with the ships they had. Yamato survived longer, but met an equally futile end. By early 1945, Japan's situation had become desperate. American forces had seized island after island, moving ever closer to the home islands. The Philippines had been lost. Iwo Jima had fallen despite fanatical resistance. Okinawa came next, and Okinawa was close enough to Japan proper that its loss would bring the home islands under direct assault. The Japanese High Command devised Operation Ten-Go, a last-ditch attempt to hurt American forces at Okinawa. Yamato would sail from Japan with a small escort of cruisers and destroyers. The force carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan called for the ships to beach themselves on Okinawa and fight as stationary gun platforms supporting Japanese ground forces. The crews would become infantry once ammunition was exhausted. Nobody expected to survive. This was explicitly a suicide mission, throwing away Japan's last functioning battleship and thousands of trained sailors in exchange for uncertain tactical benefits. American intelligence detected Yamato's departure almost immediately. Submarines shadowed the force and reported its position and course. Admiral Mitcher, commanding the American Fast Carrier Task Force, didn't hesitate. He launched massive strikes from multiple carriers. Nearly 400 aircraft converged on Yamato and her escorts. The battle on April 7, 1945, lasted about 2 hours. Yamato's anti-aircraft armament had been significantly upgraded since her commissioning. She mounted over 150 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers. These guns fired thousands of rounds, filling the sky with tracers and exploding shells. But 400 aircraft attacking simultaneously overwhelmed any defense. Torpedo planes came in from multiple directions, forcing Yamato to choose which threats to turn toward. While she turned to avoid torpedoes from one direction, planes from another direction had clean shots at her beam. The torpedo hits accumulated. 1, 2, 5, 10 hits flooded compartments and increased the list. Yamato's damage control was superb, but nothing could cope with that volume of flooding. Bomb hits started fires and killed gun crews. Communication systems failed. The list reached 20 degrees, then more. Power failed in some areas. At some point, the captain realized the ship was doomed. Yamato couldn't be saved. Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, with a list exceeding 30 degrees, magazine detonations tore the ship apart. The explosion was visible from aircraft miles away. Yamato rolled over and sank, taking nearly 3,000 men to the bottom. The most powerful battleship ever constructed had survived barely 2 hours against sustained air attack. She never fired her main guns at an enemy ship. Her massive armor and powerful weapons meant nothing against aircraft she couldn't effectively fight. The 10 or 11 torpedo hits that doomed her represented weapons that cost perhaps $10,000 each in period money. Yamato herself had cost the equivalent of billions in modern currency. The return on investment couldn't have been worse. American pilots returning from the strike described the attack almost casually. Yamato's anti-aircraft fire looked impressive but was ineffective. Planes could dodge the tracers. The ship was too slow to avoid torpedoes once planes reached release points. Some pilots expressed almost sympathy for the doomed crew, recognizing the courage required to sail out knowing you wouldn't return. But this was war, and Yamato represented a threat that had to be eliminated regardless of the human cost. Consider the economics underlying all this. A fleet carrier could operate 80 to 100 aircraft. Each aircraft cost perhaps $50,000 in period money, with the carrier itself costing maybe $100 million. So for roughly $200 million total investment, you had a weapons platform that could project power across hundreds of miles, strike targets the carrier itself would never see, and sink enemy ships that cost more than the carrier did. Battleships cost comparable amounts to carriers, but could only fight targets within visual range, perhaps 20 miles in optimal conditions. The range and flexibility advantage lay entirely with carriers. Fuel consumption told a similar story. Yamato burned approximately 600 tons of fuel oil per day at combat speed. That's an enormous logistical burden. Tankers had to be dedicated to keeping her supplied. Fuel storage had to be maintained at bases. Transport routes had to be protected. An Avenger torpedo bomber burned perhaps 150 gallons per mission, less than a ton. A carrier operating 80 aircraft might burn as much fuel as a battleship, but it was projecting far more combat power far more flexibly. Japan's chronic fuel shortage made this disparity devastating. Japanese oil imports had been cut by American submarines and later by American seizure of the Philippines and Netherlands East Indies. Every gallon of fuel burned by battleships was a gallon unavailable for aircraft or merchant shipping. The combined fleet spent much of the war anchored at bases like Truk simply because they couldn't afford the fuel to operate at sea. Battleships that couldn't sortie were useless regardless of their combat power. Training represented another hidden cost. Battleship crews required months of training to operate effectively. The coordination required to fight these ships was immense. Fire control parties had to work in concert with spotters, with turret crews, with engineering personnel maintaining maximum speed, with damage control teams managing any hits taken. Losing a battleship meant losing thousands of trained men who couldn't easily be replaced. Losing aircraft meant losing 3 aircrew who could potentially be replaced in weeks rather than months. The accuracy question deserves deeper examination. Battleship gunnery at long range was far harder than movies suggest. The target was moving, often at high speed, and manoeuvring unpredictably. The firing ship was also moving, rolling and pitching in the seas. The shells followed ballistic trajectories affected by wind, air density, and even the Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation. Fire control computers could account for these factors, but they required accurate range and bearing information. Spotters in the fire control tower could only judge fall of shot by seeing where shells splashed, then correcting for the next salvo. Against a manoeuvring target at 20-mile range, hit percentages rarely exceeded a few percent, even for well-trained crews. Torpedo attack accuracy was far higher, but only because aircraft could approach to point-blank range before release. A torpedo bomber approaching from 500 yards had a clear view of the target, could judge speed and heading precisely, and could release at an angle that minimized the torpedo run. The torpedo only had to travel a few hundred yards rather than miles. Even accounting for duds and erratic runs, hit percentages were far higher than long-range gunnery could achieve. And one torpedo hit could cripple a ship that dozens of shell hits might only damage. Japanese anti-aircraft defences improved over the course of the war, but never enough to matter against determined attacks. Early war systems relied primarily on 25mm machine guns and some smaller 40mm weapons. These had low rates of fire, limited range, and primitive sights. Crews aimed by eye, trying to lead targets moving at several hundred miles per hour. Hit probabilities were low. American pilots reported that Japanese anti-aircraft fire looked more dangerous than it actually was. The sky would fill with tracers, but most of them passed harmlessly by. Later in the war, Japan added more guns and introduced some radar fire control, but it was too little too late. By 1944 and 45, American aircraft attacked in such numbers that even improved defences couldn't cope. 100 guns might shoot down 5 or 10 aircraft, but 50 or 100 would get through. Those were more than enough to cripple or sink even the largest ships. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated either. Imagine being a sailor on a battleship under air attack. You're inside a steel box, unable to see what's happening outside. You hear the thunder of your own anti-aircraft guns firing constantly. You feel the ship heeling as it maneuvers desperately. Then comes the shock of a hit, the bone-shaking slam as a torpedo explodes against the hull or a bomb penetrates the deck. Lights flicker or go out. The deck tilts as flooding increases. Orders blare from loudspeakers, often contradictory as the situation changes moment to moment. Damage control teams rush past carrying shoring timbers and emergency pumps. Wounded men are evacuated through passageways slick with oil and blood. And through it all, the attacks continue. Survivors of these battles described them as among the most terrifying experiences imaginable. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. You couldn't fight back effectively, you couldn't escape, you could only stay at your post and hope the ship survived long enough for the attack to end. Many men died never seeing the sky, trapped below decks when ships capsized or sank. The Americans who flew these missions weren't immune to fear either. Approaching a Japanese battleship in a slow torpedo plane took courage bordering on fatalism. You had to fly straight and level for the final approach, maintaining perfect attack parameters while every gun on the ship fired at you. Zeros dove on you from above. Anti-aircraft fire traced orange paths through the air around you. Your aircraft was fragile, unarmored in critical areas, carrying enough high explosive to vaporize you if hit in the wrong place. Death could come any second from any direction. Many pilots wrote last letters before these missions. Survival rates were poor, especially early in the war. Yet they kept flying. Partly from duty and training, partly from knowledge that failure meant their shipmates and comrades would die when Japanese forces overwhelmed American positions. The torpedo attacks at Midway achieved nothing directly, but they enabled the dive bomber attacks that won the battle. The men of Torpedo 8 knew they probably wouldn't survive, but they flew their attack runs anyway. That kind of courage deserves recognition even across 8 decades. The evolution of aircraft over the war's course favoured attackers increasingly. The TBD Devastator gave way to the TBF Avenger, a far superior aircraft. The Avenger was faster, better armoured, carried more weapons, and could survive damage that would have destroyed a Devastator. Dive bombers improved too. The SBD Dauntless proved remarkably effective throughout the war, but the SB-2C Helldiver that supplemented it carried heavier bomb loads and had longer range. Fighter bombers like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair could carry bombs or rockets while also providing fighter cover. American air groups became more capable with each passing year. Japanese defences couldn't keep pace. Fighters were diverted to defend the home islands against B-29 raids. Experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained. Fuel shortages limited training time for new pilots. By late war, Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of what it had been at war's beginning. The protective umbrella that should have covered surface forces barely existed. Ships sailed knowing they would face air attack without adequate fighter cover, and knowing that meant they probably wouldn't return. The cultural factor mattered too. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit and will over material considerations. The idea that superior Japanese morale and fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages was widespread. But spirit doesn't stop torpedoes. Will doesn't prevent flooding. When Yamato capsized and sank, taking thousands of brave men with her, their courage and determination meant nothing against simple physics. The ship had absorbed more damage than her buoyancy could tolerate. She sank because mathematics and engineering dictated she must, not because her crew lacked fighting spirit. American industrial capacity made the disparity worse. Japan built a handful of large carriers and battleships over the entire war. America built dozens. Essex-class carriers came off the slipways in assembly line fashion. Each one carried more aircraft than Japan could afford to lose in a month. By 1944, the American Fast Carrier Task Force operated with such overwhelming strength that Japanese commanders simply couldn't counter it. They might damage a carrier or two, but America would replace them faster than Japan could sink them. Meanwhile, every Japanese ship loss was permanent. Ships sunk at Midway or the Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf could never be replaced. The submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping exacerbated everything. American submarines ranged throughout Japanese-controlled waters, sinking tankers, cargo ships, and transports. Raw materials couldn't reach Japan. Fuel couldn't reach forward bases. Reinforcements and supplies couldn't reach island garrisons. The Japanese economy gradually strangled, unable to sustain the war effort against American industrial might. Battleships sitting at anchor because fuel shortages prevented operations became expensive pier decorations, threats on paper, but strategically irrelevant. Intelligence work played a role too. American codebreakers provided warning of Japanese operations time after time. The Midway ambush succeeded because American commanders knew approximately where and when the Japanese would arrive. Yamato's final sortie was detected almost before she cleared port. Japanese commanders operated without operational security, never realizing that their most sensitive communications were being read almost in real time. That intelligence advantage was worth divisions in combat effectiveness. Tactics evolved as both sides learned from experience. American pilots developed coordinated attack profiles where torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters hit simultaneously from different directions. The Japanese had to choose which threat to defend against, and while they maneuvered to avoid torpedoes, bombs would hit from above. This coordination required practice and radio discipline and good training, but American naval aviation developed all those things. Japanese forces never developed effective counter-tactics because they never had the resources to do so. The targeting priority that made Musashi the primary target at the Sibuyan Sea battle reflected doctrine developed through hard experience. American doctrine called for neutralizing the most dangerous enemy units first. Battleships represented the biggest threat to American surface forces if they reached engagement range. Therefore, battleships were targeted first and hit hardest. Musashi absorbed strike after strike that might have been distributed among multiple ships because she was identified as the most powerful unit present. From a cold-blooded tactical perspective, it made sense to cripple or sink the most dangerous target, even if that meant other ships escaped with less damage. Weather played a role in some actions. Tropical storms could ground aircraft, giving Japanese surface forces temporary safety. But Japan couldn't control the weather, and clear days came far more often than storms. Planning operations around hope for bad weather was desperation, not strategy. More often, American forces simply waited for weather to clear, then launched strikes against targets that had no effective defense. The night battles around Guadalcanal showed that Japanese surface forces could still be dangerous under certain conditions. Japanese destroyer crews trained extensively for night combat, developing tactics that exploited superior optics and aggressive torpedo attacks. Several night surface actions saw American cruisers and destroyers heavily damaged or sunk. But these were tactical victories that didn't affect strategic realities. Japan couldn't win a long war against American industrial and demographic advantages. Night battles were pinpricks against an enemy that could replace losses and continue advancing. The moral dimension can't be ignored. By any objective assessment, most Japanese sailors by mid-war knew they were fighting a losing battle. But military culture and nationalism demanded they continue regardless. Orders were followed even when they amounted to death sentences. Yamato's crew knew Operation Tengo was suicide. They sailed anyway. That kind of fatalism horrified American observers who couldn't understand why Japan didn't simply surrender once defeat became inevitable. But surrender violated everything Japanese military culture taught. Better to die fighting than to accept the shame of capitulation. Meanwhile, American forces fought knowing they were winning. Morale remained high because victory seemed inevitable given enough time. Pilots flew dangerous missions knowing that the war effort was succeeding overall. Ships' crews endured the monotony of long deployments sustained by knowledge that each operation brought victory closer. That psychological advantage translated into better performance across every metric that mattered. The toll in human lives was staggering on both sides. Thousands of Japanese sailors died when their ships sank. Thousands more burned to death in fires or drowned when ships capsized. American aircrew died too, shot down during attacks or lost when their carriers were hit. But the proportions favored America overwhelmingly. Japan lost irreplaceable men and ships. America lost men and machines that could be and were replaced. The end came gradually, then suddenly. Island after island fell to American amphibious assaults. The fleet that was supposed to contest these landings had been attrited to impotence. By spring 1945, Japan no longer possessed the naval force necessary to defend the home islands. Kamikaze attacks represented desperation, throwing away pilots and planes in suicide attacks that achieved little beyond forcing Americans to develop better defensive tactics. The final battles of the war saw Japan defending with forces so weakened that American dominance was total. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the once mighty combined fleet had been reduced to a collection of damaged survivors hiding in ports. Most of the great battleships lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Yamato rested in hundreds of fathoms of water off Kyushu. Musashi sat on the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea. Fuso and Yamashiro had been annihilated at Surigao Strait in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. The surviving units, like Nagato, were damaged beyond combat effectiveness and would be expended as nuclear test targets after the war. The carrier revolution had been complete. Every navy in the world immediately recognized that battleships were obsolete. The future belonged to carriers and aircraft. The massive guns and thick armor that had seemed so impressive in 1941 were relics of a past age. New construction shifted entirely to carriers and supporting vessels. The era of the battleship was over, ended not by more powerful battleships, but by fragile aircraft that cost a fraction as much and proved devastatingly effective. Looking back across the decades, the story seems almost inevitable. But at the time, Japanese commanders thought they understood naval warfare. They had studied it for decades. They had observed Tsushima, where battleships had dominated. They had built ships incorporating every lesson learned. Their mistake was believing that past patterns would continue unchanged. They failed to grasp how thoroughly aviation had altered naval combat fundamentals. The American Navy, by contrast, adapted quickly. Pearl Harbor taught brutal lessons about battleship vulnerability. Coral Sea and Midway demonstrated carrier striking power. The sinking of Prince of Wales and repulse off Malaya showed that even modern battleships with air cover could be destroyed by determined air attack. American doctrine shifted to embrace carriers as the primary striking arm, with battleships relegated to shore bombardment and anti-aircraft support roles. That flexibility and willingness to adapt gave America an enormous advantage. Technology continued evolving too. Radar improved constantly, giving ships better warning of incoming attacks. Proximity fuses made anti-aircraft fire far more deadly. Combat information centers improved coordination between ships and aircraft. American technological advantages grew over time, while Japanese technology stagnated due to resource constraints. By war's end, the gap had become a chasm. The strategic lesson remains relevant today. No weapons system is invulnerable. No tactical approach works forever. Success requires constant adaptation, learning from experience, and willingness to abandon cherished beliefs when evidence shows they're wrong. Japan clung to battleship doctrines years after those doctrines had been proven obsolete. That inflexibility cost them the war at sea and ultimately contributed to total defeat. The human stories embedded in this history deserve remembering too. Brave men on both sides fought and often died doing their duty as they understood it. Japanese sailors manning anti-aircraft guns as American planes swarmed overhead showed courage even in futile causes. American pilots pressing home attacks through walls of fire showed equal valor. War is ultimately a human tragedy, and the Pacific War was particularly brutal. The sinking of these massive ships with their huge crews represented thousands of individual tragedies, families that would never see sons or husbands again, potential futures that ended in cold Pacific waters. So when we examine why fragile aircraft could destroy mighty battleships, the answer involves mathematics and engineering and tactics and strategy. But it also involves human factors, cultural attitudes, industrial capacity, intelligence work, and simple luck. The battleships weren't invincible because nothing is. The aircraft proved effective because they exploited vulnerabilities that battleship designs couldn't address. And ultimately, the side that adapted faster and produced more won the contest, as is almost always true in industrial warfare. The giants fell to mosquitoes because the mosquitoes attacked vulnerabilities the giants couldn't defend. That asymmetry, once established, proved decisive. No amount of armor or firepower could compensate for fundamental vulnerability to a threat the ships were never designed to counter. The age of the battleship ended not with some climactic final duel, but with ship after ship succumbing to swarms of aircraft that individually seemed insignificant but collectively were overwhelming. That's the brutal truth that Hollywood spectacles often miss, but that naval history records with stark clarity. Power alone means nothing without the ability to bring that power effectively to bear, and battleships increasingly lacked that ability as the war progressed. The result was inevitable once that became clear, however long it took for everyone involved to recognize it.